What happens when an arrogant young fighter thinks he can humiliate a living legend? When 24-year-old Marcus Lightning Rodriguez stepped into that ring, he thought he was about to make his career by destroying Chuck Norris in front of thousands. The crowd was electric, the cameras were rolling, and Marcus had spent weeks trash-talking the martial arts icon, calling him a washed-up has-been and a Hollywood fake. But legends aren't made in movie studios. They're forged in the fires of real combat, real discipline, and real respect. And Marcus was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. Because when you underestimate a man who's dedicated his entire existence to perfecting the art of combat, when you mistake quiet confidence for weakness, you don't just lose a fight, you get schooled in the most unforgettable way possible. This is the story of how one cocky kickboxer learned that true strength doesn't need to boast, and why you should never ever judge a warrior by his age. The year was 2010, and the martial arts world was buzzing about an unusual challenge match taking place in Las Vegas. Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist and action star, had agreed to step back into competitive combat at age 70. His opponent? Marcus Lightning Rodriguez, a rising kickboxing sensation with lightning-fast kicks and an ego to match his nickname. Marcus had everything going for him: youth, speed, a perfect 18-0 record, and the kind of raw athletic ability that made seasoned fighters take notice. Standing 6'2" with the lean, muscled frame of a thoroughbred athlete, he'd demolished opponents half his age and twice his experience. The media loved his brash personality, his designer fight gear, and his habit of predicting exactly which round he'd finish his opponents. But Marcus had something else that would prove to be his downfall: a complete lack of respect for the legends who paved his path. In his mind, Chuck Norris was nothing more than a relic from a bygone era, a movie star who'd gotten lucky with some decent films. He'd never bothered to study Chuck's actual fighting record, his championship titles, or the decades he'd spent honing his craft when Marcus was still in diapers. Chuck, meanwhile, prepared for the fight with the same methodical discipline he'd maintained for over 5 decades. At his Texas ranch, he trained in silence, shadowboxing at dawn, practicing forms that most fighters had never even heard of, and conditioning his body with the patience of a monk and the precision of a surgeon. The press conferences leading up to the fight were nothing short of brutal. Marcus arrived in designer suits, dripping with jewelry and confidence, while Chuck showed up in simple jeans and a plain shirt, speaking softly and respectfully about his opponent's skills. "Look at him," Marcus sneered during one particularly heated exchange, gesturing dismissively at Chuck. "This old man thinks he can hang with a real athlete in 2010. Chuck, with all due respect, your time was the 70s. This is the era of speed, science, and youth. I've been studying your old tournament footage on YouTube, and I mean old footage, and honestly, I'm embarrassed for you." The reporters ate it up, but those who knew Chuck could see something flickering behind his calm exterior. Not anger, but a deep disappointment. Here was a young man who could have learned from one of the greatest martial artists alive, and instead he'd chosen mockery over mentorship. Chuck's response was measured, almost grandfatherly. "Marcus, you're a talented young fighter. You've got speed, power, and natural ability. But martial arts isn't just about physical gifts. It's about respect, discipline, and understanding that every opponent can teach you something. I hope after our match, regardless of the outcome, you'll have learned something valuable." Marcus just laughed. "The only thing I'm going to learn is how to retire has-beens." The crowd gasped, but Chuck simply nodded, his face betraying nothing. Inside, though, something had shifted. This wasn't just going to be a fight. It was going to be a lesson. Fight night arrived with all the spectacle Las Vegas could muster. The MGM Grand was packed with 20,000 screaming fans, split between curious Chuck Norris supporters and Marcus's young, loud fan base. The energy was electric, almost dangerous. Marcus entered first, strutting down the aisle in a custom golden robe, his entourage of trainers and hangers-on trailing behind him like a royal court. He shadowboxed for the cameras, threw kisses to female fans, and even stopped to flex for a group of photographers. Every movement screamed arrogance. Every gesture demanded attention. Then the lights dimmed and Chuck Norris walked to the ring alone. No entourage, no flashy robe, no theatrics. Just a 70-year-old man in simple black trunks and boots, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. But those who watched closely noticed something unsettling. His movement was fluid, precise, almost predatory. This wasn't an old man shuffling to his retirement party. This was a wolf in sheep's clothing. As the referee explained the rules, Marcus bounced on his toes, cracking jokes with his corner and winking at the cameras. Chuck stood motionless, his breathing deep and controlled, his eyes never leaving his opponent's face. He was reading Marcus like a book. Every nervous laugh, every wasted movement, every tell that revealed his opponent's mental state. When the bell rang, Marcus exploded forward with a combination that would have floored most fighters. His hands were lightning, his footwork perfect, his kicks sharp enough to cut glass. For the first 30 seconds, it looked like every prediction he'd made was coming true. But Chuck wasn't there. As Marcus swung at shadows, missing by inches each time, something strange happened to Chuck. The noise of the crowd faded, the bright lights dimmed, and suddenly he was back in 1968, sparring with Bruce Lee in a dim Los Angeles dojo. He could hear Bruce's voice. Speed without precision is just chaos. Power without control is just violence. True mastery is being where your opponent isn't. Then 1974, winning the professional middleweight karate championship, feeling the same desperate attacks from young fighters who mistook aggression for skill. The years compressed, decades of training, fighting, teaching, learning. Every lesson learned in dojos across the world, every principle absorbed from masters who understood that martial arts was about more than winning. It was about becoming something greater than yourself. Marcus was talented, yes, but he was fighting with ego, not wisdom. He was throwing techniques instead of flowing with purpose. Most importantly, he was fighting Chuck Norris, the movie star, not Chuck Norris, the martial artist. Chuck's eyes refocused on the present, and suddenly everything became crystal clear. Marcus wasn't his enemy, he was his student, and class was now in session. The shift was subtle at first. Chuck began to move differently, not retreating, but redirecting, not blocking, but evading. His footwork became hypnotic, like watching water flow around rocks. Marcus's powerful strikes were meeting air, his lightning-fast combinations hitting nothing but atmosphere. "Stand still and fight me," Marcus shouted, frustration creeping into his voice. Chuck said nothing, but those who knew combat could see what was happening. He was doing something far more devastating than fighting back. He was letting Marcus defeat himself. By the third round, Marcus was breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face, his perfect combinations becoming wild swings. The crowd sensed the shift. The cocky young fighter was being systematically dismantled by a masterclass in defensive combat. That's when Chuck decided the lesson had gone on long enough. It started with a single jab. Not fast, not particularly powerful, but perfectly timed. It slipped through Marcus's guard like a whisper and snapped his head back just enough to break his rhythm. Marcus blinked, confused. How had such a simple technique gotten through? Then came a low kick that caught Marcus's lead leg just as he was shifting weight. Again, nothing spectacular, but the timing was surgical. Marcus stumbled slightly, his balance disrupted for just a fraction of a second. Chuck began to pick his shots, each technique a surgical strike designed not to hurt, but to teach. A gentle push kick that sent Marcus stumbling backward, demonstrating the difference between power and timing. A perfectly placed elbow block that redirected Marcus's strongest punch into thin air, showing him how force could be turned against itself. The crowd was on its feet now, watching something they'd never seen before, a complete martial arts clinic being conducted at the highest level. This wasn't a beating, it was an education. Marcus, desperate and increasingly panicked, loaded up for his finishing move, a devastating spinning heel kick that had ended several of his previous fights. He'd practiced it 10,000 times and it had never failed him. But Chuck had seen it coming 3 moves earlier. As Marcus spun through the air, telegraphing his intent like a neon sign, Chuck simply stepped aside and, with the gentlest possible touch, guided Marcus's momentum past him. The young fighter's own power sent him crashing to the canvas, his unbeatable finishing move becoming the instrument of his own defeat. The arena fell silent. Marcus lay on the canvas, not hurt, but utterly bewildered. He'd been defeated not by superior strength or speed, but by something he'd never encountered before: pure, distilled mastery. Chuck helped Marcus to his feet, his hand steady and strong on the young fighter's arm. There was no celebration, no victory pose, no trash talk, just one warrior helping another, the way it had always been done by those who truly understood the martial arts. "You're a talented fighter," Chuck said quietly, his voice carrying only respect. "But talent without wisdom is like a sword without a handle, dangerous to everyone, including yourself." Marcus stared at him, his cocky facade crumbling completely. For the first time in years, he was truly listening. "I don't understand," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I had you. I was faster, stronger." Chuck smiled, and it was warm, paternal. "You were fighting Chuck Norris, the actor. I was being Chuck Norris, the martial artist. There's a difference that 40 years of training teaches you. It's not about being the strongest person in the room. It's about being the most prepared, the most disciplined, and the most respectful of the art itself." The crowd erupted as understanding rippled through the arena. They hadn't just witnessed a fight. They'd watched a master craftsman demonstrate his art, and a young man learn the most important lesson of his career. In the weeks that followed, Marcus would seek out Chuck as a mentor, beginning a training regimen that would transform him from a talented brawler into a true martial artist. He would go on to have a successful career, but more importantly, he would carry forward the lessons of respect, discipline, and humility that Chuck had taught him that night. The story of Marcus and Chuck reminds us that in a world obsessed with youth, speed, and flashy displays of power, we often overlook the quiet strength that comes from decades of dedication, discipline, and respect. True mastery isn't about proving you're better than others. It's about becoming the best version of yourself and helping others do the same. Chuck Norris didn't need to humiliate Marcus to prove his point. He didn't need to hurt him to defeat him. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He turned a lesson into a gift, transforming an arrogant young fighter into a student worthy of the martial arts. The real victory that night wasn't Chuck's, it was Marcus's, because he walked away with something more valuable than any championship belt: the understanding that true strength doesn't announce itself, wisdom doesn't need to boast, and the greatest warriors are often the quietest people in the room. As Chuck Norris himself once said, "The true measure of a man is not how he behaves in moments of comfort and convenience, but how he stands at times of controversy and challenges." Sometimes the greatest knockout isn't the one that drops your opponent, it's the one that lifts them up.